young scientists, and welcome back to Cells. This is a new unit that we're starting with this slideshow, actually, and this slide deck, talking about cells and the history of cells. So, what better place to start than how cells were discovered? They were not invented, they were discovered. There were some inventions that led to the discovery of cells, but cells have been around as long as there has been life. So just remember, as you are looking through this slide deck or as you're listening to me talk, you might want to put a page in your lab book with the topic and the date. The main ideas or concepts are the place where you're going to write your notes about this topic, the history of cells. And as you come upon some vocabulary words, you may want to write those down, highlight them. You don't need to put the definition because the definition is on Quizlet. But it might be good to put a word or a picture or something to help you to remember what that word means. And then when you get done, the bottom part will come in with the questions and those things which we'll talk about later. So, once upon a time, actually, it's not once upon a time, this is a real true story. In 1632, a man by the name of Anton van Leeuwenhoek was born. And you'll hear more about Anton van Leeuwenhoek in the song, Five Scientists and a Theory, which will probably be on the next page of this slideshow, so make sure to watch that as well. So, Anton van Leeuwenhoek was Dutch. He lived in the Netherlands, and he was a shopkeeper. The reason why the song, Five Scientists and a Theory, has some quotes around it is because they really weren't scientists. They had other jobs. They weren't paid to do science. They were paid, or they made their living, doing something else. And Anton van Leeuwenhoek was a shopkeeper. And the reason he probably was one of the first people to discover cells was because he was one of the first makers of a microscope. He was an inventor. And one of the reasons he was an inventor, probably two reasons actually. One, he had money, because he was a shopkeeper. And second of all, he had supplies because he was a shopkeeper. Think of him as owning the local Walmart, except instead of getting frozen foods and vegetables and clothes and things that were already made, he had the supplies to make things like wood and nails and cloth. And he might have some things to use to make food like rice and beans. And maybe even he had some other types of meat and things in his shop. Sometimes people might have bartered with him and gave him things instead of money. Who knows exactly what happened? But the two reasons why he was the person to invent the microscope was money and supplies. However, when he discovered the microscope and looked at these little things, he called them animalcules because they looked like little things moving around. Animals, because back then they knew about animals. And just before his discovery, they also had learned about things in the air called molecules. So he called them animal molecules or animalcules. Now, around the same time, there was a guy from England. He was English. His name was Robert Hooke, and he kind of made a better microscope. He made something called a compound microscope. A compound microscope basically has one lens in the top where you look through and one lens lower down, so it can magnify things more than the simple microscope that Anton van Leeuwenhoek made. He looked through the microscope and looked at a piece of cork, and you can see the picture there. It shows the piece of cork, the drawing that he made of his piece of cork. Now, when he looked at this piece of cork, he said, that looks like the cells that monks lived in. And right now, most of you are saying, what are you talking about? Because we don't know anything about monks or cells that they lived in. Were they in jail? Well, no. Monks were a religious group, and they lived in something called a monastery. And oftentimes they lived either in caves, which had rock walls, and they were carved out of the rock. The rooms were carved out of the rocks. Or they lived in stone buildings, which looked like these cells that he found in the slice of cork. Now, his name stuck. Why did his name stick? We don't really know, but his name was the one that stuck. I don't know if it has anything to do with it, but England was a fairly powerful country around that time, and who knows if maybe that has something to do with the fact that cells became known as cells. Now, then there was some time that passed. If you look at the dates for Robert Hooke and Anton van Leeuwenhoek, they're very similar, the 1600s into the 1700s. However, our next three German scientists all came in the 1800s. So it was almost 200 years later before these three gentlemen did some research on cells, and then that accumulated with something called the cell theory. So very quickly, looking at what they did, starting with Schleiden. Schleiden looked at plants and plant parts and leaves and twigs, and I'm sure his neighbors brought him things and said, I got this out of my garden, look at it. And he looked at it with his microscope, and he found that all of the things that he looked at were made of these little things called cells. So he came up with the theory that all plants are made of cells. Now, Theodore Schwann, the same thing, except instead of looking at plants, he looked at animals. And he came up with the theory that all animals are made up of cells. So Schwann and Schleiden were the ones that kind of discovered that cells aren't only a building block for some things that are alive, they're a building block for every living thing. Rudolf Virchow had the exciting task of watching cells through a microscope and discovering that when there are cells under the microscope that are alive, they actually make more cells that are alive. They reproduce. And so he discovered that cells make more of themselves, and cells only make more of the same cell that they are. So they reproduce and make more. So after a while, these three gentlemen, along with van Leeuwenhoek and Hooke, who were no longer living at the time, but their ideas were all put together in something that we call the cell theory. And the cell theory is basically, if you want to think of it in its simplest form, it's three statements summarizing cell research. So they put together these three things. So there was a convention, and many scientists of the day came along with Schwann and Schleiden and Virchow. Leeuwenhoek and Hooke did not attend because they were no longer alive. They came up with these three things. They said that all living things are made up of cells. Obviously, that came from Schwann and Schleiden. They looked at plants, they looked at animals, they looked at different parts of the plants and animals, and they saw that, of course, all of them are made up of cells. The second thing, cells are the basic unit of structure and function in living things. They have structure, they make up substance, they have mass, but they also do things for the living things. And so not only are they a structure, but they're also a function. They have a job inside to do. And then finally, thank you to Virchow, cells come from other living cells. So they don't come from dead things. They don't come from dead cells. They make other cells of their kind. So that is the main points of the cell theory. So at this point, what you're going to do is you're going to, in your lab book, come up with a few questions that you can write down about this topic of the cell theory. Think of it as making like a quiz for yourself. You don't have to put the answers, just the questions. And then at the bottom of the page, if you think you got everything about the cell theory, write, I understood everything today. And if you don't, then write down what it is exactly that you still need some help with, that you still need to understand. And then also, if you still need to understand something, if you are one of those blended learners that comes and sees me a couple days a week, please ask me that question. If you are a remote learner that doesn't see me, then please send me a message through Schoology or send me an email and ask me the question so I can either explain it to you or possibly make another video or change this video so that it explains it a little bit more or a little bit better. So, once upon a time and many years ago, cells were around but nobody did know. That's just a little teaser for the song. Go to the next page and listen to the song and see if you can learn a little bit more about the cell theory. Thanks for watching.